farmers, trust is everything. At Genesis Fertilizers, we're not just proposing to build a facility, we're building a future designed for you. With real progress already underway, we're closer to providing Western Canadian farmers with a reliable, locally produced fertilizer supply. Now is the time to take control of your farm's future. Learn more at genesisfertilizers.com/credibility.
Good morning. My name is Tyler McCann, and I'm the Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Before we begin our discussion today, I want to acknowledge that I am participating in this webinar from Alberta on traditional Treaty 7 territory. Across Canada, we acknowledge the relationships with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people and recognize the importance of relationships and partnerships to moving forward. Whether it be Canada and the United States or Canada and its Indigenous peoples, the best way to make progress is together. And as an organization, we recognize that there are many steps on the road to reconciliation, and it's a journey that we must do together. The Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute is pleased to partner with RealAgriculture for today's webinar. Today's topic is a critically important one, as the decisions made across the U.S. have the potential to ripple across Canadian agriculture or to become a wave that washes over all of us. In fact, for the first time, we've had to cap today's webinar registrations because we reached capacity. For those who are here, we're glad that you registered early. The interest in this webinar highlights the broad understanding of how important this relationship is and the desire to understand what it might mean for the future. Today, we aim to understand the policy, political, and practical implications of a changing U.S. policy, but it is important to highlight that we're still very early in the early days, almost 2 months before President Trump will be inaugurated, and much of what we will discuss today is perception, hypothesis, and a little speculation. However, the speed at which President Trump has moved since the election, announcing his new cabinet, and that he will impose 25% tariffs on Canada on day one, highlight the need to act now. Our hope is that today's webinar will help your understanding of the evolving dynamics, what it might mean for Canada, and what Canada and Canadian agriculture might be able to do about it. Please feel free to use the Q&A function to ask questions during the webinar today. We hope to get to as many questions as possible. I will be back later to host a panel discussion, but I'd like to now hand it over to Shaun Haney, founder of RealAgriculture.com and host of Real Ag Radio, to kick off the webinar. Shaun, over to you.
Hey, thanks a lot, Tyler. Really do appreciate CAPI's partnership on this webinar. And this is something we've talked about doing for quite some time. And the response of, over 500 people saying, hey, I am interested in this topic is fantastic. This is a very important topic to Canadians, of course, not just in agriculture, but across the entire economy. Obviously, being adjacent to the largest economy in the world, it brings with it a lot of opportunity for trade, and Canada as an exporting nation has benefited extremely from NAFTA as well as the current CUSMA agreement. But what happens going forward? And to get the U.S. perspective here before we dive into the Canadian panel, I brought in a good friend of mine, somebody that I've had the pleasure of working every Friday with on AgriTalk, which is really the flagship of farm radio in the United States, over 120 syndicates across the Midwest and into the Northern Plains, as well as also a show on Rural Radio 147, the exact same station that Real Ag Radio is on. Bringing in my good friend, DC policy analyst for Pro Farmer, Mr. Jim Wiesemeyer. Jim, it is great to have you today here on the webinar. Thanks for joining us.
Always good to be with you, Shaun. And that's why we have Shaun on, hopefully every Friday on AgriTalk. He brings the Canadian perspective to the U.S. market. And as you all know, we need that.
Jim, okay, before we get into the 25% tariff, I want your reaction to the cabinet selections. What do you, now we've already had one situation where one person that was put forward has removed themselves, Matt Gaetz for Attorney General, but overall, what's the reaction to the cabinet selections?
Allies. If you're a Democrat, you call them loyalist. Cabinet people who probably won't write books about President Trump, and he learned a lot during his first 4 years of his first administration that I kind of measured in dog years. It felt like 28 years, and this will be not different. They are a cohesive whole. It's impressive, especially as we get into the trade environment. When you look at the Commerce Secretary, the Treasury Secretary, Commerce Secretary, National Economic Council. A lot of your listeners may not realize that when a Republican administration comes in, the National Economic Council director, in this case, Kevin Hassett, is very important because he takes on an interagency role. And of course, we have the USDA Secretary Brooke Rollins, who very close and has a lot of clout with Trump. She almost was his White House chief of staff. And from a regulatory basis, and that's going to be important for Canada because we're going to have reduced regulations for the U.S. farm sector. It'll make us even more competitive, and that's Russ Vaught.
Yeah, I heard from John Newton of Terrain. He talked about 8-to-1, the ratio that they're going. They have to pull off 8 regulations before adding one. That's a substantial ratio. Remember, 2-to-1 is one that is commonly used, so quite aggressive on that. Because of the loyalist factor, one of the things that I'm wondering and I'm a little bit concerned about is you think about it in Trump 1.0, we had situations where USDA and EPA did not get, they were on different sides of the fence on an issue, and it took USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue to come into the White House and say, whoa, this impacts farmers negatively. If we've got a bunch of loyalists, they're carrying the message out. They're not necessarily working as that conduit from farm country to the White House. Is that a concern for some of the farm lobby?
It could be. We really need to see, in the case of U.S. Department of Agriculture, who the deputy secretary is going to be and the undersecretaries, because Brooke Rollins, although she doesn't have dirt under her fingernails, she's not a farmer, she knows a lot about policy, but really 15,000 feet area. I'm going to be very important to see who's going to be deputy secretary, the glue that holds USDA together, and the undersecretary. So I would watch those, and we're going to see, that'll tell us a lot what direction they want to take USDA at.
So we're a little bit less than 2 months away from inauguration. January 20th is the day, right?
Yes.
And this week, a big time shot across the bow. We heard 25% tariffs on all goods, and all in capital letters. I'll dispute. I don't think it's going to be all, but all goods coming into the U.S. from Canada and from Mexico. Why now, and why this strategy at this time?
It's classic, not only Trump 101, but Lighthizer, former U.S. Trade Rep Bob Lighthizer, who's not yet in the Trump 2.0, interestingly so. Last night they announced Jamison Greer, 44 years old only, as the U.S. Trade Rep, but very close to Lighthizer. Lighthizer is working behind the scenes. So this begin from day one is pure Lighthizer talking with Trump. In other words, coerce, leverage, and that's what we're seeing with some of these.
Now, lumping Canada and Mexico together, Mexico's problems with the U.S. are not Canada's problems with the U.S. And the two leverage points that are being used here, one, fentanyl coming into the U.S. from both Canada and Mexico, and illegal immigrants. We know in the election, immigration's a big issue, often referred to, as a southern border issue. But the numbers, like Jim, okay, so for example, last year, 10,000 illegals crossed from Canada to the United States. 10,000. That's less than a day at times that are crossing from Mexico to the U.S. 2.4 million did so last year. And if you look at the drug number on fentanyl, it's the same kind of ratio. It's like insignificant from a Canadian perspective. What's the U.S.'s strategy here? Why treat Canada like Mexico?
Well, they want to group it because even though you're not a significant part of that, in their eyes, Canada is a portion of the problem. And that's why I think while it won't be easy for you to get a framework agreement with Trump, I think you will. And so I just think this is a clear signal. And in all my years, I've been covering the business of ag in the U.S. for over 50 years. All great men are dead, and I'm not well myself, is what I say in my speeches. But I've seen Canada rise to the occasion in trade policy arena. Frankly, I think you have better trade officials than my country does for whatever reason. So I would say you've got the makings, and I know this is the talk behind the scenes, of a framework agreement. Trump is big on framework, where you get a timeline of so many months to execute what you promised to do. And frankly, I think Canada will be able to do that.
So you think on like this, on say these two, if Canada shows some work to improve,
Yes.
and show some results, and that some of that could be based on what we did or just maybe timing of the year. If we do those things, do you think there's the opportunity for Trump to back off of Canada and make that separation, or are we just going to be on this 4-year treadmill of like, yeah, you did that, but now I want you to focus on this?
Now, and have Canada come out of the chute with that, so he can apply more pressure on Mexico, because he's got the agreement with Canada. That's what I'm hearing on that. Okay. And the reason why fentanyl, it's a national security reason. He wants to invoke from authority to do some of these things, not just our border security, but from a national security under the fentanyl. And so I think that's important. And that's why I think Canada got tied into this.
I think the timing of this week kind of caught a lot of people off guard. I'm not surprised on the action. It's the playbook. You read, you and I have talked, Jim, a lot about Art of the Deal, Trump's book about how you do business. This is right from the book.
Yes.
No surprises. But this week, I think it caught people a little bit off guard. What's been the reaction from U.S. farm groups to this?
They're already in high anxiety over the flip-flop under the USDA secretary post. So it's like they're with bated breath. They know what Trump did during the first 4 years, although most agriculture really liked. I mean, he had his best, the number, I think 70% of the rural vote voted for Trump. So they're on their side, on his side. However, there's high anxiety. Again, I give a lot of speeches, and my speech on Trump 2.0 is the certainty of uncertainty. I mean, so get ready. I measured the first 4 years in dog years, like I said. Yeah. So this is going to be the same. What agriculture wants is competitiveness. And so you got to look at this as a whole. Trade policy, tariffs are now being viewed as an advantage, not a disadvantage. Regulations, lowering the cost for U.S. producers. And with Hassett at the National Economic Council getting into the tax cuts, extending them, that'll allow more investment coming in to the United States. You put all that together, and most production agriculture in the U.S. likes that triad.
Leading up to the election, and even post-election, I use J.D. Vance, Vice President J.D. Vance, incoming. If you listen to some of his speeches, being from Ohio, or a senator from Ohio, he talked a lot about integrated supply chains, but very negatively. And a lot of times this is a reference to China. Okay. But we have a lot of integrated supply chains between Canada and the US. In 2018, when the first NAFTA renegotiation was going on, US groups and Canadian groups talked a lot about integrated supply chains. Is that kind of a cuss word right now in DC? Should we be using different verbiage as we try to talk about the benefits of the Canada-US trade relationship?
Could be. But really, again, the focus is on Mexico, China investments. And where I have seen Trudeau, I think smartly approach a review of Chinese investments and things like that. That's, to me, from a U.S. perspective, that is the route to go, because they are going to focus on any potential end arounds that China is trying to do in their investments in Mexico. So again, I'm not saying Canada is going to be scot-free in some of this stuff, but I think you have the makings to be very deliberate in how you come up with a working relationship, more than most people think with Trump 2.0.
Yeah, Canada supported, now it's the Biden administration, but Canada supported the U.S. in the tariffs on Chinese EVs.
Yes.
Got in line on that. We're dealing with maybe some potential issues on export of Canadian canola due to that decision and accommodating the Americans. How does Canada separate itself from China and Mexico? Because that's where the real negativity on trade is. So what are some of the things that we can do? Defense spending, maybe one of them, get it up to 2% like Trump's been pushing for on NATO?
NATO, absolutely. That'll get him to comment. Two is the border issues. I think you can take action that will show your area as far as controlling in that regard. And three, focusing on investigating China, their investments, not only in your country, but in Mexico. And I think that's already going on. But from a policy perspective, I do feel for Canadian producers in this regard. Our energy policy is clearly incentivizing the production of U.S. biofuels and the processing therein. And it's almost like when China switched from buying U.S. Soybean oil in the early days, in the late 70s, early 80s, to figuring out it's a jobs program. So they started importing U.S. and other countries' soybeans because they built up their processing facility. Canada may be going through the beginning days of this where you're going to export a lot more canola oil into the U.S. to be processed for 45Z program or biofuels tax incentive programs. That's just an initial indication.
Yeah, and there's a lot of coverage of I've been telling people, don't be distracted by dairy. Dairy is a big issue, and it's going to be a focal one, I would just imagine, in the next 4 years for sure. But there's other things, biofuels, internet, digital taxes, things like that, where Canada's going to probably have to do some movement on it. The challenge for Canada is in some ways, Jim, is that we're looking for points of leverage, and we're sort of blindfolded looking for levers. It just feels the U.S. side of the equation, we rely on it from an economic perspective. You can understand the sort of how some people have jumped to kind of a defeatist mindset almost.
Yeah, they shouldn't. Again, it's not going to be easier, but I think it's going to be easier than most people think. Canada's perspective, not Mexico. As far as dairy,
yep.
If you did get into a push for a return to a U.S.-Canada free trade agreement, I don't think it will surprise you that the dairy sector in the United States will come out very big focus to getting at your supply management program. You should be well aware of that. That would be one easy recommendation that the U.S. would probably want to negotiate on. But in the past, you've been quite successful in keeping it.
Yeah, one of the things that I have said on Real Ag Radio numerous times is, Canada should probably start with the TRQ allocation. There's a big fight about that. The last market access that was given up, there was an agreement on it in the CUSMA agreement, and the first dispute resolution panel that was launched was actually about dairy, and there was 4 points of ruling. Both sides claimed victory.
Yes,
and we still disagree. We agreed to disagree. I remember former Secretary Perdue saying, "Hey, Canada, you can keep your supply management, but we want market access." Do you think? Do you have any idea the significance of how much more market access potentially the U.S. could be looking for?
Not that much more. If you understand Trump, and I know you do, he likes wins, and if Canada fulfilled their TRQ promise.
Mm-hmm.
Trump would go out probably in USTR, we won. And that's Trump. That's Trump. He just give him a win. Give him cover, if you will. And I think it would go a long ways. And now, how much more market access? Again, that gets into what Trump and his people might want in further negotiations.
One of the things that we're looking at a lot is the devaluation of the Canadian dollar relative to the U.S. dollar. Is there not concern in farm country about the appreciation of the U.S. dollar and the impacts that could have on exports?
Should be. Usually you have a lag of at least 6 months for any significant impact, but our ag exports are already down. What the USDA announced yesterday in the fiscal year 2025, our ag trade deficit of $45.5 billion. Now that's primarily horticultural products, fruits and vegetables, and the impact of the dollar. I think you're seeing it. But yeah, this is a big thing there. But I think trade, the numbers are going to galvanize the USTR and the National Economic Council and USDA to come up with some initiatives, new trade agreements. You mentioned the United Kingdom or something,
Yep.
when we talked earlier. In the waning days of Trump 1.0, they were really working on a US-UK trade agreement. So I think that they'll continue that. Now, I'd have to look into where that would be relative to US dairy going into Canada, but I would behoove Canada to try to get an agreement with the United Kingdom because one's coming from the United States now.
Yeah, so you think that a bilateral, if Canada was to think about doing a bilateral with the United States, that might be the appropriate path here because of how poor the situation is with Mexico.
It could well be as a hedge, if you will, but that's loaded with potential dynamites as well, as they try to get extractions of what from Canada that we'll need. But and even in the case, Reuters had a story yesterday on the 25% tariffs that it would include Canadian oil. Well, that raised a lot of eyebrows here, but the Trump spin was that, look, the Biden administration taxed U.S. energy. I'm going to tax other people's energy.
Yeah.
So see the spin that they put on that. I clearly think that issue, they're not going to put that 25% tax on oil because
Well,
Trump he knows, and his whole campaign was get energy prices down 50% from what they were. You don't do that by putting a 25% tax on Canadian oil.
well, what about Canadian potash?
Same thing.
87% of potash that is used in the United States it comes from Canada. 25% tariff on Canadian potash, that you're just taxing the farmer.
Yeah, that's part of the U.S. farmers holding their breath that we have 2 months to get a framework agreement, and I think
Yeah.
we'll get one.
Last question, Jim. One of the differences here in 2.0 versus 1.0 is more organized, hitting the ground running. One of the other differences, though, is the talk about legislating some of these tariff implementations. So it becomes much more difficult for future presidents to just repeal, and they would need Congress's support. How real is that?
It's very real, and there's kind of linkages here. The interesting part is that farm state lawmakers want that because you can use that's revenue, okay, to get some offsets for the tax cuts coming, but they want to also put in reference prices increases in this budget reconciliation bill that will come out by probably the summer of 2025. That gets scored into the new Farm Bill budget baseline. I don't want to get too wonky on you, but it will make it easier, not easy, to get a farm bill to give U.S. farmers more higher reference prices and more crop insurance incentives. But you hit the nail on the head. By putting this into the budget reconciliation, the tariffs, that codifies it. So if any future Congress wants to pull that out, they have to find offsets for revenues because it's a revenue generator from a budget perspective. And so it's very important. And I think that's on their top 10 list of things to do that they want from Congress to codify these tariffs in a budget reconciliation bill that only needs 50 Senate votes, by the way. It cannot be filibustered. And it's coming. It's a done deal as far as I'm concerned.